Hello movie barfs and welcome back to the channel. Okay folks, let me just get this out there. 2003's Daredevil is overhated. It usually gets a bad rap of being one of the worst superhero movies ever made. But is it really that horrible? From what I've read, it seems like some of you would get headaches from all the eye rolling you do at this movie. It definitely pales in comparison to the Netflix series, and it has some awful moments. But honestly, I think overall it's still decent and passable, and certainly better than some of the lower tier MCU movies we've seen over the last few years. And that applies to the theatrical cut too, not just the superior director's cut. I was originally gonna just leave this video on the worst things about this movie, but then I realized maybe it might be better to talk about some of its highlights instead. But before we go into the better aspects of the movie, like any balanced viewpoint, I should acknowledge the weaker points of the film too, the trashy parts. And spoilers up ahead if you haven't seen it yet. Number 1, the romance was cringy. This was easily the worst aspect of the movie for me. I didn't buy their romantic relationship one bit, and I'm sure many of you didn't too. They just met in a coffee shop and then suddenly they're into each other after reliving their childhood in a playground. Did Elektra forget that this was just some random guy who followed her just after one encounter? And not to mention, she's still wondering if he's actually blind, something we'll get to later. Their romance was forced and fake and unrealistic. It's a far stretch from how people interact in the real world, and I couldn't get behind their relationship. But at least Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner had some apparent chemistry. Number 2, the movie was tonally inconsistent at times. For a Marvel movie, this was dark, probably one of Marvel's darker movies so far. I mean, when we first see Daredevil, he's beating the crap out of criminals and taking some tough hits himself. And then it ends with him letting one of them get run over by a train while he stands over and mocks him. So while the tone has been established to be something of a dark and gritty nature, we then have campy scenes like the playground scene I just mentioned. It's inconsistent with the tone we have so far. I get that we need to have some lighter scenes from time to time, but this was just taking it too far. The level of camp here is just silly, and it makes you wonder, what were they thinking? And this scene too, I hated this scene. Wow, an annoying, overly talkative grandma. That definitely isn't an overused trope. It's cartoonish and pointless and doesn't add anything to the movie, but instead detracts from it. Again, another tonally inconsistent scene that doesn't fit in with the rest of the movie. We don't need to see Bullseye getting annoyed by random strangers on a plane any more than we need to see the Joker running out of toilet paper when he's taking a dump. You could cut this scene out and the movie would be all the better for it. Number 3, the villains suck. Yeah, to put it plainly, Kingpin and Bullseye were awful here. They're completely one-dimensional and unmemorable. We hardly know anything about them because the film doesn't give us anything to get behind their motivations and their character. Kingpin's just a big brute who's rich and likes killing people for no reason. And Bullseye's just a narcissistic dude who has a perfect aim and for some reason prefers to throw objects with his hands instead of just using a gun. And he has a bullseye engraved on his head, in case you forget. Very subtle indeed. I'd say the director's cut was definitely better than the theatrical, but still a mixed bag at times. It made the hero Daredevil better, but it also made the villains worse. It starts off with Kingpin killing 2 of his henchmen for reasons unknown. This is only in the director's cut, by the way, and after seeing that, I just couldn't take his character seriously from then on. I get they were trying to make a powerful first impression, but that just came across as sadistic and crazy. As for Bullseye, the director's cut added in that absolute cringe of a scene where he goes on a narcissistic display at the airport. The level of cringe here pretty much speaks for itself, so yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. Number 4, some logical inconsistencies. This movie strays off from the source material a bit too much. Daredevil is a lot more human than how he's portrayed here. He's supposed to just be a guy with heightened senses and superior hand-to-hand combat skills. But here he's a long-distance jumper like the Hulk and leaping across some very impossible gaps that can give Spider-Man a run for his money. Those stunts aren't how he's like, and not to mention the CGI was pretty bad too. And does anyone here actually believe that Matt is blind here? He does so many things that would reveal that there's more going on. From his acrobatics in the playground to switching his coffee with foggies and then later shooting balls into hoops. It's a wonder that no one suspects him or calls him out on these. And later on, after getting stabbed by Elektra, Daredevil is pretty much put out of commission and can only lie there helpless while Bullseye kills Elektra. But then a few moments later, it's inconsistent that he's up and running and taking on Bullseye in the cathedral like nothing happened. Number 5. The music sucked. Like, really sucked. First off, the choice of music was already questionable at the time. Playing Evanescence at a funeral was just overly pulling the emo card, and then later we have Bring Me to Life in that joke of a training montage. I think these parts of the movie will work better if you mute them. And how about that cheesy Outlaw song that played during the introduction of Kingpin? Could that get any more ham-fisted and in your face? Secondly, the choice of music also dates the movie, time-stamping it with songs that no one will appreciate or care for after a few years. Okay, now that we have all that out of the way and you can see that I'm not an overly biased fanboy, here's why the movie isn't as bad as it seems. Well, no surprise, the best thing I appreciate about this movie is the character of Daredevil / Matt Murdock himself. Daredevil is portrayed as such a sympathetic hero here, and I really appreciate it here. He has real struggles, he has difficulties, he has challenges like anyone would, and the film does a superb job in humanizing him. Life isn't a bed of roses for him. In fact, it seems to be pretty painful for him sometimes. And the thing is, it comes from him doing the right thing. He still hasn't gotten over the murder of his father. His finances are in a bad state because he looks out for the outcasts of society who have nowhere to turn to and no money to pay. His romantic relationships fail because he doesn't have the time to be emotionally available. He comes home bruised and battered in his fight against crime and needs prescription drugs to manage the toll it takes on his psychological health. And all the while, he's battling the doubt that his actions are actually making any difference to the city. It reminds me of Peter Parker in Spider-Man 2, where he's basically being punished for doing the right thing, for doing good. Well, same parallel here in Daredevil. You know that scene in Spider-Man 2 where Peter just sits on his bed and sighs in gloom after a rough day? Well, the equivalent of that for Daredevil is this scene here, where he returns to his hideout after a tough night out, and you see blood trickling down his scarred body as he showers. He even spits out a tooth and then later gets dumped by the girl he's being seen. I guess I'm a sucker for sympathetic and humanized characters, and that's exactly what we got here with Affleck's Daredevil. All the odds are stacked against him, and we can easily root for him, as he's just trying to make things work out like all of us do. The director's cut adds one of the best scenes, the one where he's about to go to bed in his soundproof coffin, but he hears the cry of a woman for help. Due to his superhuman hearing, it's as if she's dying right in front of him in a visceral and real experience. But it's too late. The trigger is already pulled and all Matt can do is hear her final moments before she dies. Now imagine having to go to sleep with that as the last thing on your mind. And not to mention, he probably hears something like this every night, but he simply can't save everyone and has to turn a deaf ear to their cries for help sometimes. Can you see how the film succeeds in making Murdock a tormented hero, someone we can root for? Now, one major gripe that some viewers have is that the film makes Daredevil out to be a killer, most notably in his first encounter where the Easter egg guy, Quesada, ends up dead by a train. Now, I know Daredevil isn't a killer in the comics, and he even gives other heroes flack, but I actually don't find it much of a stretch here that Daredevil here occasionally kills. Let's play devil's advocate here for one moment, no pun intended. You have Murdock here looking at these criminals who have done horrendous things, and he's even personally seen them slip through the cracks of the law at court. Even if he somehow gets them arrested again, the cycle would just repeat itself. They would be out in no time to continue spreading misery in society. Maybe this version of Matt was so disillusioned with the system that he decided to adopt more ruthless means. I don't know, it's definitely wrong, but at the same time you can somehow get why he's like this. Poor Ben Affleck, when he puts on a costume, he seems to turn his superheroes into killers when they aren't in the source material. But the other stronger reason it's not that bad is because that's one of his character arcs. Daredevil starts off the film leaving his enemies dead, but over the course of the movie he undergoes a change. I mean, he didn't kill Kingpin at the end and spares his life, even when he knew he was standing before his father's killer. Even Batman would have killed Joe Chill given the chance. In that one scene earlier, we see Daredevil beating up some thug, but he stops when he hears a young boy begging him for his own life. Matt realizes that he's turning into the very thing he's fighting against, and it haunts him to the point that he has to reassure himself that he's not the bad guy. Perhaps he remembered his own experience with his dad when he saw him becoming an extortionist thug. But whatever went through his mind, it was enough to spark a change. Enough to change his approach. It was a simple but powerfully emotional scene that's one of the better parts of the movie. Okay, and one last point. You could argue that Daredevil didn't actually kill Quesada, but that he pulled off a Christian Bale Batman and just didn't save him. I mean, let's look at how it went down. The guy has his gun aimed at Daredevil's head. Daredevil just spun around to not get shot and to disarm him, which inadvertently caused him to fall to the tracks. From there, Daredevil just left him there and didn't save him. He didn't have to kill him, he just didn't save him. Batman did it. Aquaman did it too, but Daredevil gets a disproportionate amount of hate for doing so. Perhaps it's because he just stands there and mocks the guy right before his end. On another note, the way the film tried to demonstrate how Daredevil sees was pretty cool. I'm sure it wasn't easy to conceptualize, and it's ironic too in trying to visually show the audience on screen with their eyes how a blind superhero perceives the world. Probably why an immersive Daredevil console game would never happen. And one more thing, the humor in this movie was a thumbs up. Thankfully, it's not like some of the lame cringy MCU humor we have nowadays. There's actually some build-up and payoff, like the one where Matt ends up squeezing mustard into his tea after Foggy got pissed off. And later, after Matt Ninja swaps the cups, Foggy ends up spitting out the tea at the exact moment when things were getting serious with Elektra, effectively ruining the moment. But my favorite is the one where Murdock asks Coolio if he's innocent, and then after hearing his heartbeat and knows he's not lying, tells him he believes him. The reactions from Coolio and Foggy were just absolute comedy gold. It still cracks me up to this day, and it's a good example of using a past setup to create humor. Oh yeah, and this is only in the director's cut, which you should watch instead of the theatrical one. Like I mentioned, the director's cut adds more to Daredevil but makes the villains worse. It actually adds an entire new court case and has more law elements, something that was sorely lacking in the original. All we got in the original was this one small-time courtroom scene that looks like the inside of a clinic. But in the director's cut, we get a much bigger scale courtroom that feels worthy of a big-budget Hollywood movie. Makes it more legit, if you know what I mean. But as I said in the start, although the theatrical cut isn't as good, it's still not as terrible as everyone says. Overall, Daredevil had some pretty bad stuff working against it, but the good stuff helps balance it out and make it at the very least an average passable flick. I don't know, maybe I like it more than I should, but I don't think it's as bad as it's being made out to be. It's certainly overhated, and I guess I'll close with saying that it's still better than some of the bottom tier MCU flicks. If I've convinced just 1% of you to perhaps reconsider your opinion on it, then I guess I did okay. Ending it here, folks. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.